Good day. I am Sherilyn Francis, and on behalf of the Morehouse School of Medicine Prevention Research Center, we welcome you to part 3 of our Family Strong virtual series. Additionally, we invite you to connect with us via your favorite social media platform by using the hashtag FamStrong20. You can search the Morehouse School of Medicine on your favorite social media platform, and we encourage you to connect with us, to join, and to share the content that you find of interest during today's presentation. The mission of the Morehouse School of Medicine, PRC, is to advance scientific knowledge in the field of prevention in African American and other minority communities, and to disseminate new information and strategies of prevention. The MSM PRC strongly holds to the applied definition of community-based research, which is dynamic, emphasizes community and research entity partnerships, is focused on prevention, is tailor-made, is ethnically and culturally focused, and emphasizes health policy to advance health equity. I now present to you today's event entitled The Past, the History of Health Disparities, presented by Dr. Amavi Bailey and Dr. Tommy Begay. And now Dr. Begay.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here. I am a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry here at the University of Arizona, the College of Medicine at the University of Arizona. My focus is really on, I'm a cultural psychologist, and really my focus is on development, whether that's cultural development as far as people are concerned, or if it's childhood development in terms of changes that occur as a result of influences from the environment, whether that's caregivers, parents, or other external or environmental stimulus. And as I say that, I also am cognizant of some historical trends. Am I just introducing myself, or am I starting into our presentation?
Dr. Begay, you are introducing yourself and starting the presentation.
Okay, thank you. I am Dene, and what that translates into is I'm Navajo, American Indian tribe in northeastern Arizona, a little bit of New Mexico, and also southern Utah. And I come from the Dinet. It's the Navajo word for the area between 4 sacred mountains. So I was born and raised there, and so my perspective is really sort of comes from that exposure and also experience, and it also provides me with the lens that I work through science and also see healthcare and also see my role as far as helping people in providing a wellness structure. So as I started to say, as a cultural psychologist, you know, there's always a story. And I think that sometimes in various paradigms, sometimes the paradigms are led by, I'm just going to use this term very loosely, the dominant culture. Sometimes those paradigms are assumed to be the way that all of us view the world and also view actions, activities, and for lack of a better term, culture. And so as part of that worldview, we tend to think, or we tend to not really allow or focus on the histories of other individuals that I will just loosely call ethnic minority or underserved individuals. And some of those histories are pretty horrific. As far as the American Indian is concerned, we experienced this phenomenon known as historical trauma. In historical trauma, there are various episodes throughout history, and it really sort of comes back to the essence of colonization, of a people or a group standing in the way of the goals, the objectives of the group that's in charge. And I'll just leave it at that. But that history also influences the contemporary structures that we see today. And I'm really sort of, being as I introduce myself, being American Indian, this is the focus is really sort of how, people of color, but this phenomenon is not just unique to, obviously, to the Native American or American Indian culture. This happens to again, underserved people, or also, ethnic minority groups, or loosely called people of color. But so it's really sort of looking at that development that really sort of establishes responses or adaptations. And from a genetic perspective, this may, over periods of time, over generations, and maybe even centuries, this might establish some type of mutation to our genetic makeup. Or in certain instances, more contemporary times, it might lend to epigenetic changes that mask certain certain genes. And I'm talking specifically about environmental stimulation, environmental factors such as toxins, environmental toxins, but also from a social environmental perspective. Let's take, for instance, the impact of trauma, the impact of adverse childhood stress, and how adverse childhood stress also works on our nervous system, works on neurodevelopment. And the outcome of chronic stress or adverse childhood stress is really um, the maladjustment or maldevelopment or misalignment or misdevelopment of our stress response system. And the outcome is an excessive amount of a glucocorticoid hormone known as cortisol. And cortisol can wreak havoc as far as cellular development is concerned, as one example. There are a number of impacts of the glucocorticoid hormone. But what I'm trying to do is just really sort of provide an example, a demonstration of how these mechanisms of chronic stress can feed into uh, behaviors, interpersonal behaviors. One of the, an outcome of excessive cortisol is really sort of our immune system adapts to that, and basically a or an anti-inflammatory protein such as cortisol in acute when cortisol is released every now and then, it's an anti-inflammatory. But over a period of time, because of chronic stress, it becomes a pro-inflammatory protein, and lending to diseases, especially those diseases that affect our blood vessels, diseases of the heart, and also our metabolic system, as far as glucose is metabolized. And the bottom line is that insulin is affected, and the diabetes is associated with chronic stress. So again, I'm just kind of pointing out that the influence of history, of how the adaptations of people of color have really set up patterns of behavior. And these patterns of behavior we can call loosely just habits. And those habits can be detrimental to our health. As an example, perhaps because of one of the outcomes that I mentioned of glucocorticoid dysregulation is also an influence on the sympathetic nervous system. That's the fight or flight mechanism. And because of that, our sympathetic nervous system adapts to the chronic stress, fear, and pain. And as a result of that, it becomes dysregulated from a biological perspective. And that dysregulation gets activated as these children are that these adverse childhood stress now become adults. They are impacted. They are susceptible to chronic stress, and as a result of that, the dysregulation of cortisol, but also the hyperactivation of the sympathetic nervous system lends to eventual psychiatric conditions of anger, of utilizing behaviors such as manipulation to communicate. So I'm talking about, this is a very complex issue. We have a few minutes today to talk about that, but I wanted to kind of just provide an example of how history, and the example I'm using is what has happened to the American Indian, but this is also happens to people of color, and as a result of that, we as find ourselves in environments, again, physical environments, whether we are housed next to toxic chemicals, or perhaps our nervous system over time becomes this dysregulation of our sympathetic nervous system creates behavioral outcomes that are related to anger, to what we call hypervigilance and hyperarousal. And as a result of that, individuals may, this doesn't happen to everybody, individuals may self-medicate with substances, with drugs and chemicals, or even behaviors. There's a part of the brain, the nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmental area, that work together. But when those areas get stimulated, we feel a sense of pleasure. We feel a sense of easement. But that can easily be a mechanism to deal with the contemporary stress of today. So that was just, again, just an example of the history and what the outcomes as far as environment and social effects may be. Not everybody, again, experiences these outcomes. And again, I really want to emphasize that this is a human phenomenon. This is a biological phenomenon, and really the work that myself and others do is really sort of looking at the science of chronic stress and the impact on physiological, especially our nervous system, neurophysiological outcomes, and how that relates to disease and health disparities in certain populations. My buddy, my friend, my co-presenter, Dr. Omavi Bailey.
Yes. Listen, we didn't really get an introduction to know exactly who we're talking to, but Tommy, Dr. Begay is a friend of mine. My name is Omavi, and essentially, we're here to talk about the history of health disparities. And so in the presentation that I'm gonna call him Tommy because, that's my friend, but Tommy was talking about is really scientific and very deep in trying to understand this interaction between environment, biology, and behavior, okay? So I'm gonna show you guys a couple slides. We're gonna get into some historical facts that we can look at, talk about, and we'll let the conversation go from there. So I'm gonna share my screen. Yes, there we go. All right, let's see here. So I wanna just start, I hope you guys can see these slides. I just wanna start by saying this, repeating a part of this quote. I'm gonna summarize it. It basically says that there's no doctor or no expert that can claim to understand the complexities of health disparities, or even health, even the definition of health for everybody or for our community. That the way we understand health must be by going to the community itself, like we're doing right now, and listening and learning and exchanging ideas. And it's from that wisdom we will come to a greater understanding. So there are some definitions for health, and they all really, most of the definitions I've come across fall short. One definition is about the absence of disease. Another definition is about complete physical, mental, and social well-being. And then there's another one that's about a person's health is the condition of their body and the extent at which it is free from illness. And when I was back and forth to Africa learning about culture and health, I heard the proverb, health is the ability to laugh and to cry. Simple, laugh and cry. And the more I explore that, it helped me understand that health is about balance. So once we understand and have our own cultural definition of health, then we can understand better what health disparities means to us. And I think it's important to lay that down before we go any further. The CDC's definition in 2018 was health disparities are preventable differences in the burden of disease, injury, violence, or opportunity to achieve health that are experienced by socially disadvantaged populations. Now, while that sounds like a good definition, if the CDC has to give us a definition for health disparities, we already start from a disadvantage. We ourselves as a community should be able to define what our goals are for our health and what those disparities may look like. Too often, it looks like a picture like this, where you have a Black person and a white person. You say, well, that white man has less hypertension than my Black brother. Yes, that's true. The risk is higher, but is our objective to make it so that we have the same risk as white folks, or are we actually trying to go beyond that and understand what we do want for ourselves and what does health mean for us? Because it may mean something totally different. And if you're always trying to have what someone else has, you'll always be lacking. So I think that we can get into that conversation later. So history. Tommy already spoke about the Native American genocide, but we think about it like it was so long ago. There was a massacre that happened at the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. That was, a little over 100 years ago. So my grandmother, right, not long before she was born, the Wounded Knee Massacre happened. And this is a mass grave of women, men, and children who were killed by white military, US military. The Lakota tribe to be particular. So this is a historical event that we don't really talk about. Another way that health disparities historically has come to exist, it's as a function of trying to control another group or trying to dominate or trying to exploit or oppress. And you look at this and you say, what are all these skulls, all these bones? This was, in America, the attempt to starve out Native people from their way of life by killing all the bison. Bison that they use for every cultural element of, I don't know if it's every tribe, but a lot of the tribes use them for food, hunting, shelter. So literally cutting them off from their way of life. And we'll talk about how that affects them today, losing that way of life. It doesn't just have to be Native people. It could also be African Americans. If we have a culture and a way of life, but you don't have access to those resources, and all you have is a corner store to do your grocery shopping, that's going to affect the kind of food you eat and your health, etc. We know about slavery, but we don't talk about it. Can never talk about it enough and how brutal it was. And I'll tell you, I was listening to a special on Questlove, the drummer for the Roots. They did some ancestry on him. His second grandfather, so his great grandfather, Questlove is a little probably about my age. His great grandfather was on the last ship from Benin to the US. And it just shows you how recent it was. My grandmother grew up in Palestine, Texas. And she told me that even though in Texas, Juneteenth is about not knowing about the end of slavery until much later, but even in the 1930s and 40s, there were still people that were enslaved in Texas, that were tied to the land, that could not leave. They were being, harassed and tortured and what have you. So, colonialism, all right, brutality, and forced labor, exploitation of wealth, resources, energy, convict leasing, which laid the ground. So once slavery ended, you had sharecropping and you had an economy built on extraordinary exploitation of labor with no requirement to even provide bare necessities. Because, in convict leasing, you would lease people from the state to work your land. So you didn't need health, you didn't have to worry about health insurance, I guess, and worry about feeding them anything. They die, you just lease another one. All right. And so this is the kind of stuff that was going on in the 20th century. Lynching as well. This is talking about just the last 100 years. Okay. As I mentioned, sharecropping. And then today, even today, and since things have transitioned into another form, you have stuff like migrant farmers, where people, come as maybe immigrants or whatever, and they're being exploited, raped, abused, picking, vegetables and fruits, in farms and what have you. And this is another kind of exploitation that continues to occur today. And you see health disparities in groups that have this phenomenon, this kind of not just historical process, but current reality. We know about the issue on the border between Texas and Mexico, where children being separated from their parents. And you think about slavery and how children were being separated from their parents. You think about the exploitation of Native people being put into boarding homes and boarding schools and separated from their family and their culture. That's exactly what's still happening today, and maybe on another scale or in another way. Then you have slavery. In the past, people talk about slavery, convict leasing. We even have more now in the way of the prison industrial complex. Most of the people up in there live. And then we have brutality. We talk about the killing of unarmed Black men and women and Hispanic men and women as well. All right. And that's what lays the foundation of what we're talking about when we talk about health disparities. So when I look at it, I'm going to stop screen sharing and just talk to you guys so we could look at each other. When I look at it, I think about it it's like a triangle. Okay. On one hand, you have environment, like Tommy was talking about. And environment is everything from where you live to where you work. I mean, people you're around, your environment, right? It can be environmental exposures, like water, like we're talking about Ohio, wasn't it Ohio where they had lead in the water? You talk about environmental exposures. You can also talk about light, noise, lack of resources in your environment, violence in your environment, whatever's in your environment. And you have, behavior and you have biology. Behavior used to always turn me off because why are we talking about behavior? You mean people behaving badly? It's not about bad behavior. It's about how do all these other factors influence our decisions, our actions, and our repercussions. And out of behavior, biology, and environment, the one that we can change each day, even though it's difficult, is our behavior. And I believe fundamentally, without going into a bunch of scientific details, I just believe that the beginning of solving the problem of health disparities is one, it's the issue of self-determination. If you can't define health, you cannot solve health disparities. If you have to use someone else's definition for health and you can't set your own goals, then you're not going to ever be able to solve that problem. We have to be able to define it. That means that we have to have that self-determination. We have to be able to come to some type of, I won't say consensus, but understanding within our community. We have to unite around that definition. And then there has to be an identity that follows that. There has to be some type of image that we say, this is what it means to be a healthy, let's say healthy Black man. What does that look like? Who has defined what a healthy Black man? Is it LeBron? Is it, Obama? What does it mean to be a healthy Black man? And so the images we normally get are coming through the media, coming through our education system. It's coming through the kind of negative images that may be, coming through culture, what have you. And the positive things as well that come through how maybe who you've seen growing up, the influences you have in your family, etc. But those things end up influencing our behaviors. And I don't think we have to be wealthy or rich or have a lot of financial, economic resources to have better health outcomes. I've lived in countries that were much poorer than the US that had, like Cuba, for example, outstanding health outcomes. But they definitely changed some things in their society. So at this point, I think I'll probably just stop and let there be a discussion so I can learn from you guys. But I just really appreciate the opportunity to discuss this history of health disparities. I don't think it's a historical process that led to this, but it's a current situation. So let's have a discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Bailey and Dr. Begay. So audience, attendees, family, if you have any questions, feel free to submit them in the chat pod. Additionally, you are free to open your mic and to engage in the dialogue. So I will kick off with a question because I always have questions. So Dr. Begay, you discussed the biological context, which brings us to the point of health disparities. And Dr. Bailey, you discussed some of the psychosocial and some of the public health context within the context of how we got, and historical context and how we got here. But I have a question for those who are thinking, just as you shared, about choice and behavior. So for instance, we constantly get the message of eating right and exercising. So we know we should diet, we know we should exercise. We know that there are a host of health behaviors that we should engage in. So what do you say to those who say where we are now as communities of color, this is an outcome of choice, us choosing to partake in unhealthy behaviors, us choosing to not eat fresh fruits and vegetables, however we choose to go down to the corner store and eat fried chicken?
Well, I can answer that. I'll try to answer it. I mean, like, again, you know, I think that one of the things we have to do is have a discussion, you know, and not just ask us the questions, because I think there's a lot of very powerful opinions. But, you know, there's science behind, let's say, behind marketing. Say I want you to buy my product. I know how many times I need you to hear my jingle, see my logo, before it will take you to actually make the decision I want you to make. You know, so I think while, yes, we have personal responsibility and collective responsibility, I think we must begin to understand the role of the influences that exist, in which ways it actually it influences, let's say, our culture or our people or our family. So how do you change behavior is another kind of question. But is it the responsibility of the individual, the group, or is it external and internal? I think it's all the above. But it does take, we have to take responsibility of it, but we have to understand that there are other factors that are influencing these decisions.
Thank you. So we have a question here. We have, we're also getting a few questions in the chat pod. So statement and a question. Going beyond identifying disparities, denial was an approach by doctors. What are ways to help individuals understand their treatment outcomes? And I think this may be within the context of understanding implicit biases that may affect medical treatment. So how can a patient work to be empowered in this space in order to have optimal health outcomes?
Tommy, you want to take that?
No, go ahead. I mean, you're a healthcare provider.
You know, I think empowerment, that's a good question. I think on one hand, we live in a system that constantly is taking power away from people, okay? So we have some systemic changes we have to make, okay? You know, the way healthcare works now, for example, is you go to see the doctor, and the doctor, you know, gives you a diagnosis, and you do what they say, and that's not really how it should work. You know, there should be some shared decision making. It should be different. One way to help empower people to make healthy decisions, if you're talking about from a medical perspective, we need more people of color who are doctors. We need trust. We need trust between medical professionals in our community. Like now, we're making less doctors than we've ever made historically in the last, let's say, 50, 60 years. So there's less representation in that regard. In terms of empowerment, I think empowerment usually comes from your access to people in the community that that makes a priority to empower, to uplift, to educate, to give some type of positive outlook on things. So, you know, I think there's a lot of work we have to do in our community to bring that empowerment back. I would say now, let's say, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement is speaking up, and they're making efforts to empower people, to bring issues out, to make people talk about it, to make sure it's in front of the media, that the dialogue and the message and the words are being you know, accurately portrayed on media. Let me say this though: if you don't love yourself, you're definitely not going to take care of yourself. If you don't care about your health, you're not going to care about someone else's health. You know. So I definitely think that we have a lot of work to do to build ourselves up, because there's so much that's being done to tear us down. Whether it's images, whether it's what we see in the media, the news, the violence that comes against our community, the negativity, and we are going to have to be the ones who change that. So that's my perspective.
I also wanted to chime in. You know, empowerment is really choice. And sometimes, for whatever reason, we find ourselves not having a choice. And whether that's being in a bad relationship, whether that's living in a community where all there is are, you know, saturated foods with saturated fats and other preservatives, it really impacts our health, or perhaps not having the socioeconomic opportunities to provide a better way of life. But sort of coming back to, I didn't realize I was on mute for the first question, but sort of tying this into the first question, and that was really what is, you know, Dr. Bailey mentioned this. It's really, you know, what is our definition of health? Because health is really health and wellness. You know, I don't, you know, when we really think about, you know, taking care of ourselves, and part of that is there's an educational component. I think what I tried to connect with earlier is that sometimes our adaptations lend to addiction, lend to bad eating habits. You know, I know people, I work with people who maybe go to the all-you-can-eat buffet to deal with emotional issues, but there are physiological consequences of obesity, of diabetes, of those issues. So I think it really sort of the first and foremost issue in regard to, or factor in regard to empowerment, is really education. You know, why are situations what they are in our communities? What is, let's again, the example of not having fresh fruits, not having, you know, foods that are not bombarded with you know, preservatives and other chemicals that, you know, as a biochemist, everything we put into our mouth gets broken down. So what, you know, if it's not if it's not a carbohydrate or a protein, you know, how is that chemical being, you know, how does that impact our physiology? And then there's also the social toxic material. You know, we don't really think about that or talk about that either. I think that sometimes we have the people that we choose to be around. Perhaps they don't really have, for whatever reason, and let's just say addiction. And if we get caught up in their addiction, we are soon also addicted. And so that's again the impact of social, the impact of social interactions really sort of again sort of asking ourselves what is it that we need to, what drives us to do the things that we do. And sometimes addiction might be involved, sometimes a bad relationship might be involved that drives us to have that comfort food. But the comfort food is usually, saturated fats, and pretty soon, if we're always in that situation, we're always consuming those items. And again, it's a no-brainer with alcohol, with other illegal and illicit drugs. But it can be just whatever behavior. Sex is not illegal, but sometimes we might engage in trying to achieve that orgasm because it disconnects us from the pain that we're feeling, the emotional pain, the physical pain. And so we seek those behaviors out to try to disconnect us from the pain that we're feeling. And that pain might be associated again with changes to the brain. So I apologize for the long-winded answer, but that's also, in association to, what brings us here to think about and talk about these areas of health disparities.
Dr. Begay and Dr. Babalola, thank you so much for all of the things that you shared that are making us think. It's a lot, it's very heavy, and certainly we cannot solve it or flesh it out in one webinar. And I'm so thrilled that we're having this over a period of time. But if there was something that either of you would say you would want people to think about in terms of even a small action step that they can take, we know conversations are certainly important, and before you can act, you must understand. And I think you've challenged us in those ways today. What would be something that people could take away in terms of a next step with all that you've shared? Because it is a lot. We want to encourage people to be strong and resilient. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on what is something that you would challenge us to do as we think about a next step from this complex web of opportunity, right? To be able to live our best and healthiest lives.
I would suggest, love yourself. Love yourself in terms of being kind and gentle to yourself. We find ourselves in situations, and again, sort of looking at the underlying causes of our stories. What are our stories? How did we get to the place we're at? Whether that's a substance abuse treatment center, or whether that's a PhD program, there's a story behind how we became what we are. Now, the empowerment concept is that if we're not satisfied with that, what do we do about that? But it starts with us, and also understanding the relationships of environment and social interaction in making us the people we are today. It's still our responsibility to move forward or to move out of that situation. But I think if we can understand some of the outside factors that have helped shape who we are today, then the empowerment aspect is, do we choose to do something about that? Do we choose to seek counseling? Do we choose to seek substance abuse or food disorder treatment? Do we choose to get that degree so that it increases our chances of a better job? So I always start with the individual and the four centers of that individual: the spiritual, the mental, the physical, and the emotional components. What's going on in those four areas that comprise of a human being? Because those areas drive behavior. They drive motivation. They drive a desire to either move towards something or move away from something. But if we're moving away from fear and pain, where are we headed? And is that really, under our definition and guise or how we feel about health and wellness? Does that fall under that umbrella or under that area?
Man, Tommy, that was great. And I think the key to what you're saying is self-love. So I'm gonna try to add something to that. I think I would like to, if I was gonna impart some advice to folks who are understanding that we're living in a system of oppression in a historical time. We are in a system that is exploiting us, and it's not going to change overnight. That's the reality, right? So what we used to do that I think helped us to survive and stay alive and develop and enjoy life despite what was going on was transcendence. We knew how to transcend things. And that's one of our strengths. And I'm gonna tell you, folks who don't have that strength, they do things like commit suicide or they give up. And I'm telling you, we have such resiliency, and you have to speak on it. You have to say it, and you have to know it. Rely on your transcendence. You know, for example, music is something that helps you transcend. You find out how you transcend what you're dealing with or what you're currently in, because you know it's a process. And so as this thing evolves, we are making progress, even though it doesn't feel like it sometimes. The other thing that I think is, in terms of loving yourself and being kind to yourself, get some sleep. Do not lose sleep over what this is, what's going on in this world today. I'm a sleep doctor. Y'all probably know that. And people sometimes, what is a sleep doctor? I tell you, I figured it out. The one thing we can do as Black people is don't lose sleep over this BS. I'm telling you. Let me tell you why. When you shorten your sleep and you sleep in less than 6 hours a night, or you have sleep disorders like sleep apnea or restless legs or insomnia, you are giving yourself less time to heal. We always had one healing time a day. That 8-hour period every day was a time for you to heal and repair your body. It decreases cancer, decreases blood pressure, decreases inflammation in the body, decreases depression. It's natural, it's tied to the universe. It's timed with the sun. If you can get that in your life, do not let them take your sleep. That may be the only thing you have sometimes. I come home, I don't gotta worry about the police, nobody getting behind me or what's gonna happen. I wanna come home, I wanna go to sleep, okay? Get your 8 hours of sleep, make sure it's a good quality sleep, time that sleep so that it happens at the right time, and then you start the next day. That's what I think, to me, is one of the best things we can do to start the next day right. The sun will rise again, it's another day, and let's go at it, make some more progress. And with that being said, you know, that would be the one thing I would say. I think everybody knows that we're engaged in a struggle and we're making progress. And if you, one more thing, if you get adequate amount of sleep, you actually make better decisions. You make better decisions. You know, you tell your kids all the time, grandma told you, you're tired, you're restless, you're anxious, get some sleep, sleep on it, think about it before you know, this is something we always said. So it sounds so simple, but in your sleep, you can have a dream. In your sleep, you're not thinking about what's going on. You know, you're actually transcending your current situation. So I want to encourage that.
Thank you, Dr. Bailey and Dr. Begay, and thank you, Dr. Akintobi, for such a wonderful question. So as usual, our family discussion has run a little long, as good discussions with family members tend to do. However, we do have 2 more questions in the chat box, and thank you, Dr. Begay, for answering Mr. Tommy Ross's question, but we do have a question from Mr. Arnold, and it is specific to cortisol overload and the impact that it may have on children. So Mr. Arnold's question is essentially, so I'm going to paraphrase a little. Let's see, are we stressing or are we increasing our children's stress level by discussing racism, or let's see, imparting early learning about racism, or is it a necessary tool to survive and to navigate in a racist society?
I think there are issues that we need to discuss, and I think that, you know, too many times we focus only on the negative impact, only on the outcomes of the negative outcomes of societal issues, political issues. But I think this also can be an opportunity for strength, an opportunity for resilience. How do we move forward? How do we share love as opposed to continue to attack with anger? And these learning opportunities I shouldn't say have to be, but are more effective when we have a dialogue with especially our children, but with young people who don't have the mental capacity to really process some things that happen. And that's really what the PTSD is all about. It's a memory issue of some traumatic event. But toxic stress for children, this is what really causes the damage, to the neurophysiology or to the development of the brain, is the child's inability to by themselves deal with that stress, with that fear and that pain. And it usually there is an absence of a caregiver or an adult. So kind of coming back to the question, I think this is also an opportunity to build resilience, that we as a people in our own philosophies, in our own psychologies, regardless of where we come from a strong, resilient people. And it's been the historical traumas, it's been the colonization that has really whittled away to the point where there's a lot of people who are disconnected from that. There's a Mr. Rogers had a quote, that his mother, he had a conversation with his mother, and he brought the question out, and his mother replied to him. I don't remember exactly what the question was, but it had to do with traumatic events that happen around the world. And his mother replied, "Always look for the helpers." And that's what we are. That's the opportunity that we have, is to be the helpers, to share our love through knowledge. In the Navajo tradition, we have what's known as the blessing way, the beauty way. And this has really been, decimated through colonization and historical traumas. But the essence of ceremony is that we have in our dominant hand, we have in our dominant ways, the blessing way, the peace, the love. But in the less dominant hand, we carry the arrowhead. And the arrowhead represents we take a stand and we fight. So there's a balance between taking action, but also recognizing the importance of love, the importance of connection, the importance of warmth, the importance of guiding our children and helping our children get through these times. And we're in that period now with all the things that are happening with Black Lives Matter, with the coronavirus, with our political situations. We need to help our children navigate through that. So it's an opportunity, but it always, I mentioned toxic stress. It always has a potential, if we do not help people, if we don't help our children, that this can be the source of fear, the source of stress, the source of pain. And that's, I know that's a pretty broad description, or a broad answer, I guess. But that's what I would recommend people, parents, or caregivers.
Thank you. I think that concludes today's session. So to Dr. Bailey and to Dr. Begay, thank you for a highly informative and engaging presentation. To our attendees, thank you for joining us. Thank you for supporting this work, and thank you for sharing the series with your friends and family members. Again, we invite you to find the Morehouse School of Medicine on your favorite social media challenge. And on behalf of the Morehouse School of Medicine Prevention Research Center, we thank you for joining today's event, and we look forward to seeing you next week, Saturday. Have a wonderful evening.